Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today, we're going to be looking at the recycling of matter on Earth. So specifically, it's the law of conservation, but this is kind of the biogeochemical application to all of that. So something that you're probably aware of is, what is the law of conservation of matter? So you probably remember that the law of conservation of matter says that mass or matter can't be created nor destroyed, it just changes form. So it's just recycled. So just like we have reduce, reuse, recycle, the Earth is constantly doing that with every element that makes you up. So, for example, we have carbonic acid, let's say. So, carbonic acid can be found in a lot of things. It can be found in soft drinks, it can be found in acid rain, it can be found in the ocean, just because, carbon dioxide, when it dissolves in water, makes carbonic acid. And so that could be broken down and broken apart. And I could break these little bonds apart and I could break them apart into water and I could make carbon dioxide. I'm totally able to do that. And then that carbon dioxide can then be absorbed by plants. And so when that carbon dioxide and that water is absorbed by a plant, that can be used to make something a little bit more complicated like glucose. And then that glucose, when that plant, let's say we burn it. So let's say, we burn that plant, returning some of that, nice little carbon dioxide and water back into the atmosphere. And then that can make more carbonic acid. So this kind of repeats and can be recycled over and over and over again. So the first cycle that we're going to look at is the carbon cycle. So what you need to know about the carbon cycle isn't a whole lot. And the reason why is because this is a brief overview, but we're going to go into a lot more detail later on. So the carbon cycle can generally be described as, well, we, like animals, release CO2 when we breathe, and plants absorb that CO2 and they fix it in order to make glucose, in order to make sugar for themselves. And so something that happens though, if, we're looking at a plant's life cycle or something, if a plant dies, if we die, if, we still have a lot of carbon in us. So what can happen over time is that we can be turned into fossil fuels. So fossil fuel literally means that, whatever dead stuff was around under enormous pressure and heat and stuff can be transformed into things like oil, into things like coal, which now we still burn, which then releases more CO2. So again, dead organisms can be slowly decomposed, or they can be transformed over time into things like oil and coal, which we still burn today. And so here is a little graph of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And you can see, as we keep burning more and more stuff, and as, human population keeps going up, and as we chop down trees, atmospheric CO2 levels are increasing on average. Now, CO2 can enter water. Okay, like I said, it can be absorbed by water and make carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can weather away rocks. Those rocks can release nutrients back into the water. Coral, for example, absorbs carbonate ions, which are basically nutrients from rocks. And like it says, these nutrients can combine together to make calcium carbonate, like limestone, used by coral. So again, just a brief little look at the carbon cycle, which is, by the way, again, this is totally more complicated in this picture, but this is just a couple little facts about the carbon cycle. Now, what about the oxygen cycle? So the oxygen cycle is like the opposite. Plants make oxygen, we use oxygen. O2 levels have been going down, obviously. I mean, that's something that makes sense. If CO2 levels have been going up, then O2 levels have probably been going down. And part of that is because of deforestation. If you chop down a bunch of trees that are making oxygen, they're no longer going to make oxygen anymore. And then to make it worse, sometimes we burn those trees. And if we burn those trees, now we're making more CO2. And we just removed a gigantic oxygen producing organism from Earth. And so O2 in air can lead to the formation of ozone in the atmosphere. And so that's a little process we'll talk about at the end of this year when we go over environmental stuff. And O2 can also, through oxidation, become fixed. So oxygen can become a permanent part of certain rocks. Oxygen is one of the most abundant elements in rocks because oxidation, because things like rust, which is iron plus oxygen, right, are what happens when over time, oxidation occurs. So again, the Earth's crust is full of oxygen, but not oxygen that you can breathe, oxygen in the form of ions. Hydrological cycle, something that you are definitely familiar with because it is like a standard all the time in every class probably that you've ever had science in. So the water cycle, aka hydrological cycle. So you know all about this, but something that you might not know is that the amount of water on Earth does not change very much. Where it is stored, though, can change dramatically. So, if a bunch of icebergs melt, the water levels aren't going to go up. So, if you have like an iceberg in the ocean and it's floating there and it disappears and melts, that water is not going to flood a bunch of stuff. Part of that is just density and buoyancy, right? So, but that's a whole chem thing and physics thing that we don't want to get into. What we care about is what if instead we're talking about, ice that's trapped on land. So what if we're looking at, a gigantic iceberg, but instead of being in the ocean, it's attached to land. So it's on land. It's not in the ocean. It's on a mountain somewhere. And then, it melts. All that water will raise the ocean's levels. And that's because it's not directly in the ocean. It's off the ocean, it's on land. And so when that melts and that water goes into the ocean, that's definitely going to raise the water levels. Water, though, can be stored in any of these places: the soil, plants, rivers, clouds, the ocean, lakes, animals, groundwater, glaciers. It can be stored everywhere. And so just know that, water evaporates, it condenses, it precipitates, it can infiltrate the soil. It basically runs off, back to the ocean and back to freshwater storage devices like lakes. The water cycle is really complicated, but pretty common. Like most people are pretty familiar with it. Next, the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is pretty cool. The nitrogen cycle, I always like to start with just air because air is 70% nitrogen gas, N2. So, it's most of the stuff you breathe in, but your body doesn't use it in the form of gas. So there are two types of bacteria that control this cycle. You have denitrifying bacteria, which converts nitrogen waste into N2 gas, which, clearly there's a lot of denitrifying bacteria because 70% of the air is made up of nitrogen gas and they convert waste into nitrogen gas. And then you have nitrogen fixating bacteria, or in the ocean, nitrogen fixating algae. And so that converts the gas that's in the air into nutrients for the soil or for the ocean. Now, who produces the waste? Well, most of the time it's animals that produce the waste. We produce a lot of nitrogen waste in the form of urea. Reptiles, they have, uric acid. And then fish produce just ammonia. So there's a lot of nitrogen waste products. One example is urea, which is in your urine. Nitrogen is found all over the place, though. So it's not just found, in us. It's found in nitrates and nitrites, which are ions that you find in rocks and in the soil. And plants use nitrates and nitrites in their processes. So we get most of our nitrogen from plants or from animals that consume plants. Also, they easily dissolve in water, and they are used by algae to grow, which can also cause some problems. Called eutrophication, which when we do environmental stuff, we'll talk all about that. Now, phosphorus cycle. This is going to be the last cycle we talk about, but the phosphorus cycle has two parts to it. We're not really going to focus on one of those parts, but we will be focusing on this specifically, decomposers. So decomposers break down dead plants and animals, and in the process, they return phosphorus to the soil in the form of phosphates. So again, phosphates are ions. Little mushrooms and stuff, like decomposers. They're the ones that help to fix phosphorus for us. So plants absorb phosphates and use them to grow. We, eat phosphates through plants and through animals, and it becomes a part of our cells. And then, this cycle kind of goes, it forms its own little mini cycle. So, phosphates are in the soil because of decomposers, but then plants and animals use those phosphates and they become a part of us. But when we die and when the plants die, the decomposers then take that phosphorus and put it back into the soil again, making its own little mini cycle. So that's called the short-term phosphorus cycle. But then we have this huge, large one here. because phosphates can also settle in soil, and then also water can be kind of like a nice little erosion use or technique to get some of that phosphate into the water. And then something that you just need to be aware of are that weathering, releases phosphate that has been trapped for sometimes millions of years. So this process happens very quickly. This process happens very, very, very slowly. And that is our brief introduction to the biogeochemical cycles. So if you have any questions, let me know.